5 years ago, something tragic happened at my local high school. Something that shook our entire community. It was something that stayed on the edge of everyone's consciousness, but was only spoken about in hushed whispers. Teachers would talk about it, and adults would mention it. My classmates and I weren't equipped to handle it. It was a word that took on the shameful connotation of a dirty word. By now, I'm sure many of you have guessed that the word I'm talking about is suicide. Most of the time, the desire to not talk about suicide comes from a place of good intention. But let's think for a moment. What does this message of silence communicate? The stigma that arises from silence sends the message that suicide is a shameful thing, that mental struggles are a weakness. In my experience, silence only further isolated the students who were already struggling. Silence made everyone else feel powerless and without the knowledge of how to help those around them. Not only has suicide touched my life, but it has touched countless other communities as well. According to the CDC, there's one death by suicide every 12 minutes in the US alone. It's happening all the time, but let's face it, it can be difficult to know how to even start talking about it. Since the incident 5 years ago, I've continued to have experiences with suicide through friendships, family, media. By the time I got to high school, I wanted to get involved in something that made me feel like I could genuinely make a difference. So I became a volunteer at the Oregon YouthLine. YouthLine is a national team-to-team crisis and support helpline. For 2.5 years now, I've volunteered here on weekly shifts talking, texting, and online chatting with people about mental illness, emotional issues, and suicide, issues we've historically considered invisible. But before we can talk about suicide, how do we notice its invisible signs? Too often, we don't know how to recognize when someone's struggling. But there are a few symptoms, if you will, that I've learned to look out for. If someone you know starts making terminal statements, this is one of the easier to identify symptoms of suicide. Terminal statements can be phrases like, "It won't matter soon," or "I don't care anymore." Some other signs may be harder to recognize, though, and they may be a little unexpected. For example, say you have a friend who suddenly chops off all their hair and dyes it purple. Well, this could just indicate a sudden change of pace. It could also indicate a sudden lack of care. Another sign is peacemaking. Sometimes before a suicide, a person will start making amends with those around them and start giving away their personal belongings as gifts. Well, again, this alone could just indicate a change of heart. It could also reflect someone trying to leave the world on a good note. If someone you know has been struggling with a long stretch of depression and very suddenly appears happy, this may not be the positive change it seems to be. They may appear happy because they've just made a plan for suicide, a plan that right now they believe will solve their problems. These things can be very hard to notice, but it's important just to have them on our radar. After identifying these signs in person, the next question is raised. How exactly should we talk about suicide? We need to be having the right conversations both before and after the fact. How can we be proactive instead of just reactive? Through my experience on a crisis line, I've learned that there are 4 steps you can rely on to have responsible one-on-one conversations for suicide prevention and intervention. Say you have a friend who you believe might be thinking about suicide. You can initiate a conversation with this friend. You'll want to do this in a private place, one-on-one, when you know you have enough time to talk. The first step in talking to this person about suicide is asking about it explicitly. Are you thinking about suicide? Don't dance around the word suicide, because it's not a word to be ashamed of. If they're not thinking about it, they'll tell you. Even if they say no, you've opened up a space for them in the future if they ever do need to talk. And if they are thinking about suicide, chances are they'll be relieved that you asked. Now, if the person is in fact thinking about suicide, you can move on to the second step of risk assessment, or figuring out the person's immediate safety status. A couple of important questions to figure out someone's safety is, do you have a plan for suicide? If yes, do you have the means to follow through with that plan? If yes again, would you be able to keep yourself separate from the means for a while? If they have a plan and means and are unable to keep themselves separate from the means, you may need to find a way to involve more help. But if the person's not in immediate danger, it's safe to move on to step 3, which is talking about what has brought them to thinking about suicide. Talking and listening is critical in prevention and intervention. This is when you want to let the other person take the lead. Ask open-ended questions and listen to the answers non-judgmentally. This is not the time to talk about yourself or to give advice. Validate that whatever they're going through is stressful or painful or challenging or overwhelming. Affirm the positive attributes of the person and the fact that they felt comfortable telling you how they're feeling. Let them say everything they need to say. Don't rush this conversation, and don't try to solve their problems, even if you think you have a solution. It's just not the time. After they've expressed everything that they need to, you can look for a turning point in the conversation, or anything that may inspire them to want to stay safe for the time being. A turning point can be anything from the person saying they wouldn't want their family to miss them, to just wanting to eat their favorite pancakes again in the morning. After you've identified a turning point, you can move on to the fourth step of safety planning, or just finding a way for them to stay safe for now. The idea of safe for now can be asking the person what they can do in the short term just to take care of themselves. Maybe it's watching a movie, going to a friend's house, taking a shower, drawing, journaling, anything that would put them in a safer state of mind for the time being. Now, what happens after a suicide? How do we talk about it? Say a suicide does occur in a community. What should people do in response? It's normal for people to want to express kindness in the form of putting flowers by the person's locker at school, or planting a tree in their honor, or having a plaque made. And while these are all very thoughtful ways to memorialize the ones we love, they may actually damage a community more than provide solace. Expressing such public displays following a suicide can inspire those who feel unseen to want to receive the same love in the same way. It shows that if you feel invisible, this is the way to be seen. As much as we as humans want to show our love for someone who has died, it is so crucial not to glorify the death through memorialization. Last year, one of the cheer coaches at my school died by suicide, and the school handled it a lot more responsibly than they had in the past. Instead of leaving the affected teens to their own devices, they brought all the cheerleaders into practice together and told them what happened. They didn't give any details of the suicide, and they had grief counselors in the room available to talk to. The next day at school, they cleared a room in the school available for the cheerleaders to go if they needed to talk or just get away from class for a while. This is exactly what suicide postvention should look like. It allows people affected by the death to talk and process their emotions without glorifying or romanticizing the death. 5 years ago, we didn't have this healthy space to grieve, so people turned to the memorialization instead, and this led to a contagion culture. And there was almost an epidemic of suicidality and self-harm. However, what happened last year with the cheer coach didn't encourage this culture because people grieved instead of memorialized. After a suicide happens, it needs to not be pushed aside, but also not put in the very center of attention. It's a delicate balance. It needs to be talked about and not made to be something shameful or embarrassing, but at the same time, it needs to not become the focal point like it tends to in most media portrayals, because that sends a dangerous message about suicide. So, after a suicide happens, we can have these conversations that allow people to grieve in healthy ways. Before a suicide happens, we can build our communities out of individuals who are willing to have these one-on-one conversations. But what it comes down to is more than that. In terms of suicide prevention and postvention, the way we talk about suicide needs to change. This includes the normalization of conversations like these, but it also includes the language we use when we talk about it. For example, you may or may not have noticed that throughout this talk, I haven't used the phrase commit suicide. Historically, we've used the word commit because suicide used to be considered a crime. But our language is very outdated. It has not been a crime for a very long time, and it's not a crime now, so instead, I've used the phrase die by suicide. Similarly, someone can't have a successful suicide attempt or a failed suicide attempt, as we tend to say, because it's not a success to die, and it's not a failure to live. Therefore, a suicide attempt is not complete, it's not successful or unsuccessful, it is instead a complete or incomplete attempt. These changes are very minor, but they can make all the difference in connotation. Obviously, we are all bound to mess these things up from time to time, and that's okay. But I want to bring it to your attention that we need to be aware of the language we use and the way that verbiage changes over time, because using words and phrases that demonize suicide and make it seem like a bad or evil thing only worsens the issue. We need to talk about these things, even if it makes us uncomfortable, because right now these issues are hiding in the shadows. The well-being of our loved ones takes precedence over our own discomfort. Talking about things like this can be scary because it makes us feel vulnerable, and that's totally understandable, but talking about it is the only way to end the stigma. People hide their problems in shame because they think they're alone, but they aren't. We need to normalize conversations like these. My hope is that through prevention by talking with people one-on-one individually and through postvention by healthy grieving, we can start to destigmatize suicide and other mental health concerns. Through healthier practices of prevention and postvention as individuals, as communities, we can start to break the silence around this topic. Today, what I ask of all of you is to check in on someone. Think of somebody you care about and ask them how they're doing. Suicide is just one small part of the bigger conversation we need to be having about the importance of mental health and mental well-being. We can have this conversation together. We can change the narrative. We have the power to make the invisible visible. Thank you.